first is what is the traditional conception of talent on the continent that we've always known, right? So honestly, you can take it in any way you've thought of, but typically when you're speaking with somebody that's probably a local company or a global company and they've thought about talent on the continent, what is based on your experience, some of the things you've heard or some of the things you have discerned that they've thought about when it comes to, folks who are 20 to like 40 years old working on the continent?
Um, so I like the fact that you use the term conception because it also opens up the room for misconceptions, first of all.
Mhm.
So when we speak of conceptions of African talent, generally, it is talents that are in the work age that are of African descent. That's the general theme or construct for African talent. Talent or people that have certain skills or abilities that are of African descent that are able to provide value to an organization or an institution or an economy. But if you wanted to dig deeper into that, in the current dispensation of the world in which we live in, the term African talent doesn't just speak to your descent. It has certain connotations that accompany it. Some of those connotations are time barriers, language
Mm,
barriers. So when an
mm,
employer hears African talent, those are the things they also hear by default accompanying the term African talent, not just that you are off the African continent. And some of those things a lot of them are misconceptions, but some of them are also correct. You know what I mean? The purpose of today's podcast, I believe, would be to look at how we could, move people away from the misconceptions to what the facts and the realities are and how we can position, and that's what this podcast is really trying to do, how we can position the talents that are of African descent in the accurate sense of what they are and what they represent to the global workforce. Do you know what I mean?
mm.
So that would be my answer to that question. Um,
Yeah, and I think so. I'm going to follow up what you just said in terms of what do they mean to the global workforce. So some of the stats, and I'm sure you guys have looked at them, right, are saying that, for instance, come by 2050. So this is 2026. So we're looking at 25 years from now. Africans, first of all, every one person in four people are going to be African. Let's start there. Where we've also heard that um, every 85% of the world's working population is going to be African. That's a significant number. So when you hear something like that, what do you think that data is saying, not just to companies on the continent, but globally? And Juanat, I'm going to lead into you for this one.
Yeah, I mean, those statistics are very telling, right? And one of the major things that they're telling us is when we think about a talent resource pool, Africa is going to be one of the biggest talent resource pools. And this is definitely going to shift the narrative because I think for a long time, when people think Africa, they think, oh, it's where we get all these natural resources, it's where we get diamonds, it's where we get our copper, it's where we get our platinum. But not enough people are talking about that's where we can get most of our talent.
Hmm.
And these stats are showing us that in no time at all, that's about to be the reality. When you're hiring and you're applying for jobs, a majority of the applicants are going to be African, right? And so there's a need to address some of these misconceptions that Victor was talking about, right? These ideas of, I think one of the experiences I've had is when people are trying to hire somebody on the African continent, there's always this fear that it's going to be really hard to find somebody who is, self-led in their work and can really be excellent. But when you think about it, as Africans, excellence is baked into our culture, right? Excellence is our default setting. The way we don't do things halfway. And I think that's a side of the continent that is very underappreciated. And many times we've had somebody say, I'm not sure I'll be able to find someone on the continent, but just look. And then we come up and we bring them 4 or 5 really great people. And they're like, oh my God, it's so hard for me to choose. How can I choose? Because they didn't think that they could actually find candidates of that caliber. So major thing that's saying to us, Africa is about to become the world's biggest talent resource. pool. And so it's very important that starting now, we start investing in that. We start dealing with the misconceptions that we have. We start leaning into talent on the continent, resourcing them so they grow, skilling them up, because we are shifting very rapidly into a skills-based economy instead of just a knowledge-based economy. But yeah, Victor, if you have additional thoughts on that.
I think you've done a fantastic work. So we're looking at two components, and I have my notes here, so that's what you see me looking at. We're looking at the global workspace for global employers and for companies that are on the continent. For global employers, I think it would be number one, challenging or reframing the thought process, like you mentioned, about how we think about talent on this part of the world. That's the first component of it. The second part is accepting reality that, listen, no matter how great your company is, no matter how much potential your company has, you would forever need talent, right? Talents that are even going to build the AI machines and the robots that will take over some jobs. You're going to always need talents. Like, you cannot be a CEO of a company with zero staff. Like, it's not just going to work for talent. You can't really scale that kind of a business. So that it's two things: those misconceptions, and then facing the reality of what the future holds. For continental companies, it is number one, accepting that reality, and number two, leaning more into that reality. And leaning more into that reality comes with a variety of responsibilities. One of those responsibilities is beginning to, number one, invest in the right tools and infrastructure to nurture and entice those talents. So that could be using more efficient processes, like hiring tools, for example, so that those people are not looking at global ATS or jumping on LinkedIn to find international opportunities as their primary sources of work or income. And I think on the second part would be guarding the current talent that you have and upskilling them, because in the next few years, there will be a scarcity, there will be a demand for those talents. If you do not come up with the right structure for like compensation, welfare, and protecting the current talents that you have, you might just train them at some other international company and just take them, because they're going to be the majority in the market anyways. You know what I mean? So those would be my points for that particular question.
Right. I just want to jump in there because while you were speaking, so we had spoken before, right, about again the this thing that's happening between, international employers and tradition employers on the continent. And I think I'm sure you guys know this. So in Nigeria right now, when it comes to software developers, 38% of them are hired by international companies. So they are living in Lagos, right? But their skills are serving a different company in another part of the world. So if you do the math, that's like only 62% of the skilled software developers are actually available for the Lagos or um the Nigerian like companies, right? Now my question is, and Victor, you touched it, but I want to dig into it, right? Like what is this thing that's happening right now where in our last podcast, we spoke about how 78% of people who are employed right now in sub-Saharan Africa are trying to leave their jobs to better ones, versus this new increase in the um, attraction, right, of international companies to African talent. What are we seeing in that discourse? Um, and really, the question then is, how do you think that companies here in Africa can retain their talent? What are the things that we've got to do? Or should we do them either way? Like, should we just like leave la vida and just like hope things work out eventually? But I'd love to hear your thoughts. Farata, you feel like, I feel like that question sort of was right at your doorstep. So I'll jump to you.
Well, the trend we're seeing it's pretty straightforward. I think people talk about it a lot, even in daily life. There's no one in this room or no one listening to this podcast who hasn't had at least one person say, I want to look for a job elsewhere, not in this country, elsewhere. So what we're seeing is a lot of people, an increasing number of people who are being employed outside their countries by a number of international companies. And that's advantageous for them. Why? Because they get paid in a different currency that is much stronger than their local currency, which means they're making more money. And so honestly, I'm smiling because when you said, what should local companies do? I'm like, hey guys, the competition, the competition is tough. Like economies are failing in a number of countries, and for more and more people, it's really about making more money so you are able to live a good life. But also, interestingly enough, for the newer generation, like Generation Z, it's about welfare, it's about well being, working in a place where you feel appreciated, you are not overworked, and you are offered flexibility. That's part of where the attraction is with working remotely for companies outside the country. When I'm working remotely, I have flexibility. I can do my work at night. And then if I have children or if I have errands, I can run them sometime during the day. All I need to do is have a device with me. So local companies, the competition is stiff, but it's not impossible. It's what Victor said. We really need to lean in on creating working in healthy working environments for people, environments that allow for good work-life balance, environments that compensate them fairly, you know? For everyone, it's not about being paid more. It's about being paid well enough to live comfortably. And if that's a problem, just make the environment more flexible. As somebody who, I mean, I personally once upon a time worked outside the country. I'm working inside the country again, but I worked remotely for a company outside the country. And I remember thinking, I need more time to pursue my other passions. And so I said, hey, for my new contract, can I work 4 days a week instead of 5? And they said, okay, that's fine. I cannot think of a company I've worked for in this country that would allow such a thing, such flexibility. If I said, hey, I work 4 days a week instead of 5, they say, Kwarata, are you crazy? Do you want this job or not? Um, so really, I think it's important that local companies create systems that compensate workers fairly, that are flexible, and really prioritize well-being. And I think that will give them a fair shot. We're seeing a number of, Nordic countries that have started adopting 3-4 day work weeks. That's flexibility, right? You have your people for 3 or 4 days out of the week, and you have them that are most productive because they have a longer weekend, they have more time to refuel and pursue their personal passions. These are just things that should be considered. We should really study some of these Nordic countries because they score very high on the happiness index. A lot of people living in those countries show high levels of happiness and satisfaction. And it's worth figuring out what are businesses, what are companies in those countries doing that we could potentially adopt and do here to give us more of an edge and to keep our talent on the continent. So that's my 2 cents. I'll hand it over to Vic.
Yeah. So speaking on this question, I'm here thinking about it, and honestly, I sympathize with our local companies, and here's why. If you have a company in a lot of African countries, and I've worked with a bunch of them, and we've recruited for a lot of these African countries and for companies that are hiring across different countries. You'll find that if you take the average international, chances are they probably would pay better. And it's not because we're not willing to pay better, but there's only X amount of resources at every given company that can be used to pay staff. It is just the reality of running a business. You can't use all your resources to pay your staff. Your company's going to run down at some point. You have shareholders that require that you bring a profit at the end of the year. You have stakeholders that you have to compensate for different things. You have OPEX costs, you have CAPEX costs. Like, there is only X amount of resources. So the point I'm trying to make is, for many of the local companies, they are also victims, and I use that word significantly. They're also victims of the economic reality of the African continent.
Mm.
So even if a company wanted to pay 3 times more what they were paying their staff right now, it's just not possible. They don't just have the money. They are not making that much money to pay that much money. It's as simple as that. Which is the reason why, when you look at what's happening with the Japa syndrome, or what's happening with the developer situation in Africa or in Nigeria, where 32, 38% are working for international companies, it is the local companies can't oftentimes just compete. We can try, honestly, and it's not their fault. It's my point. That's why I sympathize with them. Do you know what I mean? Because, for example, when you look at subscription services, they are not very successful in this part of the world because people are not just willing to pay. So if you started in Netflix, and there are many that have started to, form like the African version of Netflix, they have all failed. Uber succeeded because he had foreign capital to sustain it. Both in Nigeria and, in the West African market succeeding because he had foreign capital to sustain it. Now, there are exemptions, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just acknowledging how difficult it is because you see how politicians and governments that are responsible for managing an economy and the businesses in that economy are victims of the realities of that economy, no matter how good intentioned or goodwill they are. So what do I see happening in the near future? When I hear we're going to have, 1 in 4 people African in the next 25 or 50 years, we're going to have, 25% of the workforce population of the world are going to be African. It excites me, but it worries me at the same time. It excites me because that's a lot of potential. But it worries me, and I hope I've not digressed on the question, but it worries me because if you think about how our natural resources have, quote unquote, been exploited by foreign companies, it's because we always are behind. We don't have the tools to process these materials into finished products. So the best thing is to sell it as it is, and then we import it later. So we have software developers working in Lagos, for example, who work for a Google and end up paying Google subscription services to Google that they work for, because there's nobody building at the scale of Google on the continent yet. So even if we had 25% of our population as part of the workforce, that is not what excites me per se, because we could be working and adding value to another company and still exporting the end product of that service. And even we who are working for them are paying them out of the money they are paying us to use that service. So that tells me we need to invest more in innovation and take more risks. That is the only way we'll get to competency. So if you ask me what can we do with all of that information, it is innovate and take risks. Take risks and bet on ourselves more. Take bigger bets. And of course, it's not going to be just private institutions. We need government support as well. And that's something that nobody can single-handedly control or change. So when I think about it, that's the part that bothers me, because we could have a podcast like this and individual companies will be inspired. We could also have government individuals inspired, but governments are typically made of upwards of 100 people. What are the chances of getting those 100 people to function as good leaders in this part of the world? So I think it's a significant conundrum. And I don't think we have all the answers just yet, but it's worth thinking about and, just pondering on.
Yeah, that's
I have a bit of a controversial question. And I think this goes to both of you. This question came up because, Vic is making a really great point about how we need to invest in innovating and risk taking. And you also make a really good point that a lot of these foreign countries have a leg up, right? And I'm sure you're familiar with this, but there's so many ongoing conversations about Pan-Africanism. And of course, there's major radicalists who believe we should really just close the continent off, remove all the external influence from the West. And that's when we'll be able to focus and innovate and really build. Because right now, very few of the things we're building are growing at the rate that competition in the global West is growing at. What do you think about that? Do we stand to gain from such a radical action? If we woke up tomorrow and said, we're closing off Africa as a continent, no products from the global West are going to be used here. We're going to innovate as a continent. We're going to share the innovations that we have across borders, and we're just going to grow. We're going to take that risk. Do you think that would be more beneficial or harmful to the African people? And of course, let me know if I'm sidetracking the conversation. Yeah.
I think that's a heavy question. I think there are two ways to look at it. But I think
Mm.
if I was to summarize it, and it will come down to the leadership. If we have a good leader, take the top three economies, Nigeria, South Africa, for example, just if we have a sound leadership structure that is truly focused on the people, it doesn't matter how much, it doesn't matter how much Western influence we have. If you have a persevering mind and a strong leader that knows exactly what it takes and is ready to pay the price and, lead with a sacrificial mindset, I think we can crack anything. Do you know what I mean? So I'll
Mm-hmm.
give you
Mm-hmm.
examples. For example, what happened in Senegal, where the leader said, we're going to cut off countries and we're going to build this stuff, and within a short period, he has done some significant stuff. But that's the kind of mindset we need. But we don't need it. I'm not sure. I would say we need it almost. It doesn't matter whether we're radical or not. What matters is be a good leader and maximize the resources we have. Because if you think about it, for
Mm.
example, I've been privileged to work in the sales environment, right? And one of the principles of sales is go for the best paying client and charge the highest amount you possibly could charge. That's the principle to make more money for a company. So a company looks at it and says, listen, we are making 20% margin, it's too risky, we're raising our prices. If you truly offer value, your price increase should not necessarily break your infrastructure or break your business. Same thing for Africa. So if we're selling, for example, copper, right? Or let's use talent, for example. If we had laws to protect those talents and ensure that there was a minimum wage, for example, or that there were guidelines or guardrails to ensure that the team is protected, then we could make revenue from that as well and channel that revenue into innovation. So there are many ways around it. So ultimately, I think it comes down to who is leading us, what is the state of their heart? Are they really focused on sacrificing whatever is needed to ensure that the continent or the country which is responsible for the people in that particular region are growing at an exponential rate? Are we still thinking about, oh, let's build the next fanciful road? Because, for example, countries are competing. I always say this to people. Countries like America and China are fighting for artificial intelligence as though it's gonna be the end or the start of the new world. And then you have countries in Africa, for example, take Nigeria. We're still fighting over elections and who builds a road. So you can see how far
Mm.
the thinking. So in the next 10 years, when they're hiring AI engineers and talents to support the AI infrastructure from Africa, we'll not even be having the conversation because we've not started talking about it.
Mm.
So I don't think it's whether we close it off or don't close it off. If we close it off and we didn't innovate, now necessity is the mother of innovation. So chances that we could innovate. But if you don't still have the right policies in place, there's no encouragement for people. They're just going to find a way to leave.
Mm.
There are countries in the northern region where you have for example, this might not be the best example. You have women's rights are stifled, and it's as though they're going to produce some caliber of women that it ends up just repulsing the entire system. And then women just grow up and the places where in Africa before women don't go to school. And we thought if we kept them as growing good mothers and they'll be better mothers. But now we have a crisis of people that are not very educated, not very skilled, and we're now trying to deal with that situation. So closing off would work. It would allow us to innovate a little bit, but I don't think it's going to be the solution ultimately. It wouldn't make us compete at the end of the day. And that's the goal,
Mm-mm.
to be able to compete so that we can bring in more revenue, more resources, and make a place for ourselves on the global stage. So if you close yourself off and you're not doing any of that, even if you were making progress and your economy improved by 3 to 5%, we'll still be undervalued. We'll still not be respected. But if we open ourselves up and
Mm.
conclude everything was because of influence, then it means we're simply not taking responsibility. That's like saying everything you do, I influence you to do it because I know you personally and I send you messages. I could influence some parts of you, yes. But if you have a strong mind and a strong will and a strong sense of vision and you
Mm.
are determined, I think you are able to, no matter what the resistance or the influence looks like, you can think of the common good and do what is best for the common man of your people. That is what I believe we need. That is what I believe is going to break it. Because when you look at every other country that is doing it, they are all influenced by one other thing or the other. But ultimately, they will put their country first and their people first.
Mm.
I think that's what we need more than anything. For employers as well, same thing. That's why I said we have to invest in the talents that we have. But again, they are also victims of this economic reality. So even if they wanted to increase the budget for training, if the money is not there, the money is not there because there's no buying power from their consumers. So it's a serious conundrum that, like I said, is worth thinking about and worth pondering on.
Yeah, I'm gonna. So as you guys are speaking, I think the thought that came to mind. So I love. So Harata, you sort of did this thing where you've put us now like continent wise, right? And with Pan Africanism and looking at us as like a unit. Um, my first answer to your question would be, do I think we should close off? I think not right now. I don't think we can. We have the ability to sustain the livelihood, just people surviving, right? Based on the current systems that we have, such a massive shutdown. I also think like I'm also someone I believe that our best comes from collaboration. I think what we've had for the most part has been exploitation. So that's why we are where we are. But we genuinely build good relationships with the international community. We have so much to gain, right? That's my perspective. But as you even mentioned that question, and I thought, okay, fine, if we shut it down, even as Victor was speaking, I think the one thing that's a core issue with whether it's the Japa syndrome or any other thing that makes 78% of people who work for a company think, hey, I want to get out, is the lack of ownership, the feeling of ownership. So bringing it down to like this, this microcosm of like one company, I'm almost wondering what you guys think about the idea of like for us to compete on the continent, taking the route of equity-based compensation for employees, such that they feel like they have a skin in the game. And across all ranks, across all leadership tiers, like what if we created, what do you think about companies doing that? Because we can't, if the trend of international companies hiring from the continent increases, the what I'm thinking is like the only other way to get people to even have some sense of loyalty, right, to companies would be to like have them to buy their loyalty through equity, like saying, hey, okay, part of your income is going to be you're going to earn this amount, right? And I don't know what that means for like voting and things of that nature. That's something you have to figure out with your lawyer. But I'm almost thinking, what do you guys think is the actual reality of having equity-based compensation as a norm on the continent? Do we have the mental, emotional, traditional capacity to to have something like that here? Thoughts. Yeah.
Arjun, do you want to go first?
No, you can go.
So here's what I think, and I spend a lot of time thinking about things like this. Maybe not the equity part, but just thinking about just the workforce and how my answer to the question will be this: we already have equity-based ownership in Africa. It's not new, it's not strange. But if you met the average Nigerian, Ghanaian, South African, or Kenyan, or what other country have I seen recently? Let's use those countries. From my experience, you would find that particularly Nigeria, Ghana, and Kenya, if you offer them equity for a company without a monthly compensation, the challenge is because of the economic realities of these countries, they are competing for other things. They're essentials. So if you tell a person, I'll give you 5% of this company, but I'm not going to pay you X, I'm not going to pay you any money for the next 2 years. The question is, how are they going to eat for the next 2 years? How are they going to pay rent for the next 2 years? How are they going to feed their kids for the next 2 years? How are they going to do anything that requires money, which everything requires money for in the next 2 years? That's the
Right.
question.
So
It's the same
right,
thing.
but I'm thinking
Go ahead.
right. No, I want to get like so the reason I'm interrupting, and sorry, is because I want to get like the best of your thoughts. So I'm thinking not just so the base would be with monthly compensation. Like, I mean, you can't match the pay for like a Google, but with monthly compensation plus equity as part of like their total compensation package, like having that be like a norm. Because I agree in terms of like you can't have people starving. Yeah.
So when people offer equity, typically, it means lower compensation. it means you won't get the. Do you understand what I'm saying? Which also there's a scarcity problem, is what I'm trying to say. There's not enough. For for example, look at the inflation rate in a country like Nigeria, 15% year on year. You don't get 15% increase in your compensation year on year. It rarely happens. Very few employers can even afford that. So the economy is running at a pace that nobody realistically and mathematically could keep up with. And then you want to reduce the compensation and offer them equity. What's the value there for that? So what I'm saying is it can work, but there would always be that compensation because there is a scarcity problem. So we would have to begin to think about. So I think it will start from the macro and the so it's both the macro and microeconomic factors that will play a role. Do you know what I mean? Like the economy itself has to be moving at a pace that is reasonable, such that within the confines of what you're being offered, your standard of living does not relegate you to a lower cadre in life, that you sacrifice maybe your health or your other social privileges because we are trying to factor in a business that there is no guarantee would eventually become something substantial enough for you to cash in those equity shares. Because equity is uncertainty at the end of the day. So now, if we came to that person with an offer for an international company where they can pay everything that allows them to save, travel, take care of their family, plan on probably getting a house or doing other things that they want to do on their personal time, what do you think is going to happen? There would always be that exploitation option. Are you seeing what I'm saying? So that for me is what I sense is the biggest challenge from our experience recruiting people, because you have people there are times they would have people who want to recruit for organizations, and by the time you get to the interview, they're excited. After the interview, they found a different offer, and the excitement drops, and they go for a different offer. That takes us back to square one. It's frustrating, yes, but does it happen in every market? It does. Don't get me wrong. But oftentimes the problem is, even by the time we are drafting the JD and talking to the client, we are telling them, hey, this is the range we recommend for this role. And they're saying, this is the budget I have. And the budget is maybe 50% of the range. So we already know that it's not the best, but they want the best talent.
Yeah.
But they don't make enough money to pay the best amounts too. But doesn't mean they want to go for complacent and underqualified talent. So it's a trade-off at every point in time that is so complicated. You know what I mean? And of course, there are many other factors, but just to answer that particular question, I think those would be the key things I would identify. I'll just answer that question that you asked. So yes, it can work in some way, but I think it just comes with inherent challenges that the promise of equity itself is not enough to solve or address.
Yeah. No, Victor he made a really excellent case, really. I have no subtractions from that. And just to emphasize what he was saying about the need for a shift to happen at the macro and micro levels, that is so important. Like right now, I'm even thinking equity alone is not enough to keep, anyone at a company. You've offered me equity. Okay, cool. I'm getting paid less. Inflation is going up every year. That equity alone is not what's going to keep me motivated. In that company itself, also, there have to be shifts in the culture. Make me actually feel like I am involved in driving the company, because equity implies that I am a part of that. This is my company. And when you own something, you want it to do well. You want to have a say in certain decisions that are made. And realistically, if you have 0.5% equity in a company, when we're calling a shareholders meeting, we can't always call everyone. Usually we call the major shareholders. How do you make that person with 0.5% stake feel involved in the decisions? Feel like, this is my company, I own it. Yeah. It's not enough. There's as much as we want to stay somewhere because we feel like we own it and this is our passion, this is our dream, we're changing the world. Your children will still look you in the eyes tomorrow and say, what am I carrying to school? Are my school fees paid? I don't have winter clothes. That's just our reality. There's so much more that needs to change even outside of companies for that to actually be a thing that can happen and be supported. And speaking for Botswana's context alone, I mean, we're running something now called the Botswana Economic Transformation Program, which identified that, right? There's a lot of potential for private sector businesses to make drastic change in the workforce, in our unemployment rates, because we have, unfortunately, very high unemployment rates. But the thing that is holding them back is the red tape. We don't have policies that can support proper function of businesses, right? We don't have systems that allow businesses to be able to expand, earn more income, and pay people an appropriate minimum wage of 4,000 pula a month. There's that realization that the system needs to change on a national, governmental, policy, political level for there to be internal change and for talent to be able to get more of the business that exists. Yeah.
Well, guys, so this has been quite the conversation. Um I think if there's anything I'm getting away from this is there's a lot of structural issues, right, that are on the way of Africa taking advantage of its potential, which is African talent. And, companies have quite the challenge, right? If you're on the African continent, you're a CEO, you're a HR leader, you're building anything, right? Um, I love what Victor said about like now we've got to dig into innovation and risk, right? And with that too, you need capital. So it's gonna be a fight. It's gonna be a fight. So before we wrap this up, um, for our listeners, I have one question for you guys, right? Just key highlights from all that we've spoken today. What is one thing you want, like someone who's thinking about their staff, somebody who's thinking about their company 5 years down the line from now, somebody who is thinking about maybe the macroeconomics of the Pan-African agenda? What is one thing you want them to take away from this conversation and think on to achieve any level of success? And Victor, I'll start with you.
One thing I want people to take away from this to achieve any level of success, I think, is those two things I mentioned. First of all, innovation and risk. Individually, think of ways to innovate. Let's go away from creating more fintech apps to thinking about things that are rudimentary and fundamental. Agriculture is very heavily unexploited, right? Let's think of how we can add value internally so that we can also provide it externally. What I mean is import, export kind of a situation. Reduce imports, increase our exports. So I think individually we need to begin to introspectively think about how we could, on an individual level, create value. For organizations and companies, I think it would be, while acknowledging your reality, take more risks, right? So find, for example, our banks are so comfortable with funding housing projects, road projects, government bonds, and everything that is so safe. But you don't have a lot of risk capital going to the next agribusiness idea. So we must be willing to fail. We must be comfortable with failing. We must be comfortable with, if we're making 100 million whatever currency, let's dedicate maybe 5 or 10% to that as risk capital to see how we could break the next frontier in business or innovation somewhere in a different industry that is not conventional to us. And therefore, government, you will need to provide those supports and those systems that would support all of that and almost guarantee that those risks are worth taking in the first place. Because oftentimes, when companies see positive signals from the government, you hear things like they're hiring more people. Or when they see the economy is gloomy, they pause on things like hiring. You know what I mean? So everything eventually follows that micro and macro interaction. So I think on those three levels are the things I think people should take out of this. It will be innovation and risk on an individual, corporate, societal, and institutional and governmental level to ensure that we can really compete and not just complement what foreign entities are doing to us and for us.
Yeah. Horaton?
My one thought is outside of increasing people's compensation, because we understand the way of the world, the way of the economy, it's not possible. I would really love for local companies to start thinking about what they can do to make the experience so worthwhile for talent, for African talent, that they want to stay on the continent. We are losing so much potential. And not everyone is driven by the need to earn more. They just want better working. A lot of people just want better working conditions. Maybe your compensation is enough. Ask ask talent what they want, ask talent what they can do better, what you can do better, and do it. You are losing out on such a valuable resource. You're losing out on innovators. You are losing out on the brightest minds in the world because you're not willing to change and you're not willing to learn. Learn from what companies in other countries are doing as well. Don't be afraid to take a risk, even if it doesn't cost you money. Change up the work culture. Try pilot a working from home 2 days a week thing and see if productivity changes. Sometimes it's those little changes, those little shifts that will keep the workforce happy and keep them in the country. That's my 2 cents.
Yeah, that's strong from both from everyone. I think this has been quite the conversation. I don't know what our listeners are thinking, but I think this is one of those conversations where there's not like a pretty bow after that you can just like tie and be like, okay, here you go. But I agree. I think I agree on all kinds. I think doing more to help the talent that is so rich and growing be more seen. Doing more as a company to prove ourselves and to prove our growth within and despite the economy that we have here, because there's always a solution, there's always a way out, and I 100% agree that taking risk and trying to be innovative and finding new ways to do new things is the way out. So for everyone who's listened to this conversation, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much, Parata. Thank you so much, Victor. It's been such a pleasure, and we're gonna come back again with another topic. So see you guys. Take care.
Everybody
Bye.